The West confiscates Russian assets. Observers believe that the West's confiscation of Russian assets to aid Ukraine's reconstruction will likely lead to many consequences, deepening tensions between Russia and the West, affecting global economic and political situation. The Financial Times quoted estimates from the Kiev School of Economics, KSE, Ukraine, that Ukraine has lost more than $250 billion in economy and infrastructure since Russia launched the war. Special military campaign in Ukraine in February 2022. Meanwhile, Western countries have blocked Russia's total assets worth more than $300 billion abroad to prevent Moscow from profiting from the war. These countries even want to confiscate Russia's frozen assets to aid Ukraine's reconstruction. According to Reuters news agency, up to now the European Union, EU, has frozen Russia's total assets worth more than $200 billion. Belgium, the country holding the presidency of the EU Council, announced that EU members had agreed to use profits from Russia's frozen assets in Europe to aid Ukraine's reconstruction. According to Reuters, this agreement will soon be approved and legally examined before being applied. Obviously, if the West wants to confiscate Russian assets, it will encounter many legal barriers. It's easy to say, but it's difficult to do it. The US blocked more than $5 billion in Russian assets in the country, according to Politico. In June 2023, the U.S. House Foreign Affairs Committee passed a bill allowing the U.S. to confiscate Russian assets to aid Ukraine's reconstruction. The bill still needs to be passed by the Senate and signed into law by President Joe Biden. According to Politico, the above bill includes important provisions such as 1. Ensure that Russia will be responsible for compensation for damage caused in Ukraine. 2. Grant Washington the right to confiscate Russian assets in the U.S. and transfer these assets to Ukraine for reconstruction. 3. Allow the U.S. State Department to work with partners and allies to confiscate additional Russian assets abroad. In addition to the above countries, Canada also froze more than $3 billion in Russian assets in this country, according to CBS News. In June 2022, Canada passed a bill allowing Ottawa to confiscate or sell assets owned by individuals and organizations on Canada's sanctions list, including Russia. However, the Canadian government has so far made no move to confiscate or sell Russian assets because Ottawa's current priority is to help Ukrainian civilians affected by the conflict. Meanwhile, Moscow warned that any country that confiscates Russian assets will be considered theft and Russia will respond accordingly. In April 2023, Russian President Vladimir Putin signed a decree, establishing a mechanism that allows Moscow to temporarily take over foreign assets in Russia in cases where these countries are involved in the confiscation of Russian assets or commit acts of terrorism, threatening Russia's national, energy, and economic security. According to Foreign Policy, the Western confiscation of Russian assets to aid Ukraine seems beneficial on the surface but has many potential consequences for Kiev and the world. First, it could become a double-edged sword, making it difficult for Ukraine to receive more aid in the future. For example, American politicians who oppose aid to Ukraine could use this money as a reason to stop providing aid, arguing that Kiev already has enough resources. Second, Ukraine's receipt and use of the money could cause the country to lose its advantage in future negotiations. According to Foreign Policy, ensuring Russia compensates for damages after the conflict can be used as a bargaining chip for Ukraine to achieve more favorable conditions during negotiations. If it receives Russia's frozen assets and uses them up at this point, Ukraine will lose that advantage. Third, the confiscation of Russian assets to aid Ukraine's reconstruction also creates many consequences for the world economic and political situation. According to Foreign Policy, the confiscation of Russian assets, if it goes smoothly, could set a dangerous precedent, allowing other countries to confiscate each other's assets in the future. This could also cause global instability, weakening the world's legal system. In addition, confiscating Russian assets could deepen tensions between Russia and the West, making it difficult for international cooperation efforts to solve common problems such as climate change and anti-terrorism. Finally, the confiscation of Russian assets could cause concern among investors, making them worry that their assets could also be confiscated if they are seen to support a government or country that the West disapproves of. This can make investors susceptible to Western financial channels, even withdrawing money from the West to switch to other financial channels that they feel are safer. According to Foreign Policy, to minimize the negative impact of confiscating Russian assets, Western countries must consider carefully before implementing especially there needs to be clear legal regulations on asset confiscation, ensuring legality and fairness. Is confiscation of Russian assets a punitive measure? Confiscation of property in Russia is not a sanctions measure, foreign policy quoted Ms. Agata Demerais, senior member of the European Council on Foreign Relations, ECFR, Germany, European Foreign and Security Policy Research. According to Ms. Demerais, sanctions are temporary, intended to cause economic loss and change the behavior of individuals, organizations, and entities being punished. Meanwhile, the confiscation of Russian assets is an act of depriving individuals and organizations of property ownership rights. Although the same purpose is to cause economic loss, the nature of these two actions is different, Ms. Demerais explained. Ms. Demerais also said that confiscating assets is a difficult action to carry out, because it easily violates international legal principles.